Hello and welcome to another episode of Smart Freight Conversations, where we share interesting and important information and updates about freight decarbonization and the drive towards a zero emissions logistics industry. My name is Andy Golding. I'm the head of Academy here at Smart Freight Center, or SFC, as you'll hear us call it, and I'm your host for today. This is part one of a three-part series exploring climate logistics. We are going beyond decarbonization. We are looking at the broader role of logistics in the climate crisis. Joining me for this three-part series is none other than Professor Alan McKinnon. Alan is a globally recognized authority on logistics and transport decarbonization. As Professor Emeritus at Kuna Logistics University, he spent decades shaping how businesses, governments, and international bodies think about making freight more efficient and more sustainable. His research underpins key frameworks like the GLEC framework, the ISO 14083, and he has been a long-time contributor and collaborator with the Smart Freight Center. Additionally, he's advised organizations from the OECD to the World Economic Forum and beyond. I think it's safe to say that few voices are as influential in the push to decarbonize global logistics as Alan's is. Alan, it's really good to have you on the episode today.
Well, thank you for that glowing introduction, Andy. And it's a pleasure participating in your podcast series. As you say, I've been closely involved with the Smart Freight Centre now, I think, for over a decade. So I look forward really to having a conversation with you about this subject, which I'm calling climate logistics.
Let's dive right in. So I have a quote here from you from an article that you wrote, and you say, moving and storing stuff lies at the heart of our battle against climate change. So you've been speaking a lot about climate logistics and as a broader framework than just decarbonization alone. What is climate logistics? Can you give us more?
Perhaps I can begin with a bit of backstory on this because I've devoted much of my academic life really to looking at the relationship between logistics and climate change. I published my first paper on the subject actually 31 years ago, right? But almost all of that work has been on decarbonisation, how we cut emissions from logistics activities. And it's not just that that's dominated my thinking. I mean, it has the thinking of many business people and government policymakers and so forth. And then a couple of years ago, it occurred to me that really logistics role in the climate crisis is going to be much greater than simply decarbonising logistics activities. So I gave a conference presentation on the subject. I then published a journal paper. I've posted a few online articles on the subject. And the more I think about it is, as you said in that quotation, that logistics is going to have a fundamental role to play really in the way that we manage this.
You say that logistics is going to have a fundamental role and more than just decarbonization. What does that look like? And that's a very loaded question. I acknowledge that.
That's it, yes. Okay, so I reckon logistics will play 8 roles altogether, right? If I just run through these 8 roles. So the first one, it's a cause of climate change. So it represents about 12% of energy-related CO2 emissions. But then you have to factor in the other greenhouse gases. You also have to move from a tank to wheel to a well to wheel calculation. And if you take all that into account, logistics is a big contributor to the climate change problem. Second role is as a decarbonizer, because efforts are now well advanced, obviously, to cut emissions in logistics. The third role is that of a victim, because I argue there are very few economic activities that are as vulnerable to climate change as is logistics, because it's geographically extensive, there's close interconnection between all the various links and nodes, and also because these days it's handled in a very time-sensitive way. The fourth role is that of an adapter, because clearly efforts are now being made to adapt logistics to climate change and to climate-proof infrastructure, for example. The next role is that of a facilitator, because in addition to try to decarbonize itself, logistics is also helping other activities and other sectors to decarbonize. One of the main ones is clearly energy. As we put in place a renewable energy infrastructure that is involving the movement of vast amounts of material. If we think of circularity, because many people now feel that if we're going to hit our net zero targets, we've got to make our economy much more circular. So logistics then has a key role to play, obviously, in reverse logistics. The next role is that of a rescuer, because what we're witnessing now is a sharp increase in the demand for humanitarian logistics services, which are climate related, right? I think last year was 340 million people in the world required humanitarian support, many of them living in climate stressed communities. The seventh role is that of a remover, because if one looks at the definition of net zero, that's not just mitigation. We're not going to hit our net zero targets simply by cutting emissions. We will now have to remove large amounts of greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. And that will impose quite a heavy burden on logistics, right? There are about 16 or 17 different ways in which we can do this, although the research on looking at the transport and storage demands of these carbon dioxide removal methods is still at a fairly early stage. I think we can conclude it will involve a lot of logistics. And then my eighth role is rather controversial, which is the contribution logistics could make to geoengineering. Because if our mitigation and sequestration efforts prove inadequate, then we may be forced ultimately to what some people call turning down the sunlight, or resorting to solar radiation management. And again, if one looks at some of the early work on this subject, that will also entail the movement and storage of a lot of materials. So that's a quick run through my 8 roles. And so use the term climate logistics as the collective term for those contributions.
That's a lot to digest. It's fascinating. I think anybody unfamiliar with the statistics, learning that, do you want to give us that 12% statistic again? Let's get it from the proverbial horse's mouth.
Yes. So it's reckoned that logistical activities account for around 12% of energy-related CO2 emissions. So of that 12%, about 10% of that comes from freight transport, probably about 1.5% of it, maybe a bit more from warehousing. And then you also have to factor in some allowance for the administrative and IT aspects of logistics as well. But that's only CO2. And it doesn't take account, for example, of methane. Gets emitted from liquid natural gas use, nor from the refrigerant gases that we have in the cold chain, some of which have 10, 11,000 times greater global warming potential than the CO2.
So, even if we just look at the CO2 stats, the numbers are scary enough to, I think, hopefully make anybody sit up and take note. Looking at these 8 roles, there's so much that we could dive into and unpack. The one that jumps out for me so much is, if I look at what you've just described and I think of the role of logistics, I really kind of see logistics as a center point and as an anchor point for which so much change can come from, and where also so much change needs to happen to be feasible, sustainable, productive change. But you talk about logistics as a facilitator. I would love to hear more about what you see as some of the possibilities, the potential of logistics as a facilitator, because I also think that any logistics professionals or freight stakeholders listening to this conversation, it can be very easy to get very disheartened of, how do we fix this? Like, that weight can feel really heavy. Like, what's the point? And we definitely want to make sure that people know there is a point and there is a lot that can be done. And so I really like the idea of thinking of logistics as a facilitator of this change. Yeah, maybe even as a catalyst for change.
So if you think of how other sectors are decarbonizing, energy is the one that I mentioned. So we're having to move lots of wind turbines, solar panels, we're having to build dams for hydropower, nuclear power stations, and so forth. All of these things are very logistics intensive. In the case of renewable energy, for example, renewable energy is fundamentally geographically dispersed. There was some work done a few years ago comparing a coal-fired power station in Germany, and to replace that with wind turbines, you need about 1,100 wind turbines dispersed over quite a wide area. So renewable energy is just fundamentally more logistics intensive than producing energy using fossil fuel. Of course, once that renewable energy infrastructure is in place, you no longer have to move the coal and the oil and the gas. You have that upfront logistics burden, if you like, in putting that infrastructure in place. And the other one I mentioned is circularity, because there's some work being done to say that if we could make our economy 28% more circular, we could save about 39% of CO2 emissions from the economy as a whole. But
Wow.
circularity means increasing the reuse, the remanufacture, the recycling of materials, and therefore we have to create closed-loop supply chains. Now, we're heading in that direction, but we have a long way to go to achieve these targets for circularity that people are now expecting.
Long way to go, but we're heading in the right direction. I think that's a really nice note to focus on. So we have these 8 roles. We've spoken a little bit more about logistics as a facilitator. Which of these roles do you feel is maybe currently under-recognized or underutilized by industry or policymakers?
Well, many of them are, but one I will highlight is adaptation, which then links obviously to logistics as a victim. I think we need to put a lot more time, effort, and resource into climate auditing our logistics systems. Interesting, because there is quite a lot of work being done on transport infrastructure. There's a big literature on how we climate-proof transport infrastructure, and governments are investing, probably not enough, but they're doing what they can to reduce the risk of transport infrastructure being damaged and then to increase its climate resilience. But what's being overlooked is the softer side of all of this, the sort of operational and managerial aspects of climate change adaptation by companies. There was a paper published a few years ago in which logistics systems and supply chains were identified as, quote, blind spots in climate adaptation. But recently we've been experiencing more extreme weather. The frequency, intensity, duration of extreme weather is increasing. And what that is showing is just how vulnerable many of our logistics systems and supply chains are to climate change. And so there's now a big effort, it seems to me, to see just how exposed they are and also what can be done about it. The other thing is many companies are simply relying on insurance to say, okay, we may have some vulnerabilities, but at least we're insured against that. But it's interesting looking at some of the recent work by insurance companies to say that given the increasing threat that climate is posing, that many assets in climate stress regions may just be uninsurable. So you just cannot rely on that in the future. And so businesses are going to have to put in place systems to defend, if you like, their logistics operations against climate change. And just one final point I will make. There's been some work done in the UK recently on flood risk. And what they found in the UK is that warehousing is the commercial land use that is most exposed to climate change, more so than offices or factories or shops. So again, I think that should concentrate the mind of logistics managers on that subject.
So, Alan, now we've spoken about logistics as a facilitator. We've spoken about logistics as an adapter. I really enjoyed what you said just now about needing to focus more on the softer side, the managerial operations side of logistics. And maybe as a final closeout question for the first episode of this 3-part series with you, if we look at where the world is today and our current state of being, what is your hope for the conversation or the theme of climate logistics? So let's say you and I sit here again in 2 years' time and we record another podcast episode. And maybe 2 years isn't a fair time frame, but I would like to hope that it is. What would you like to see happening or see starting to happen in the theme of climate logistics?
Oh, okay, well, one thing I would like to emphasize is the interaction between the 8 roles that I've mentioned to you. Because it seems at the moment, a lot of the thinking on logistics' role in the climate crisis is a bit siloed. And it's siloed in the sense of not working out just what the freight transport requirements will be of the various roles. So I've mentioned adaptation. Adapting not just our transport infrastructure, but our whole built environment to climate change is going to involve the movement of a lot of materials. Carbon dioxide removal, which I mentioned briefly, again, is going to be a material and transport intensive activity. And at the moment, the models that we use for forecasting the future demand for freight transport don't take adequate account of all of these climate related increases in the amount of freight movement. That's got implications for decarbonization. Because if we're now going to have to move and store vast amounts of extra material to manage the climate crisis, that is going to make it harder for us to decarbonize logistics. And I don't think proper account is currently being taken of that. It may even go beyond that because some of these activities might just put in enormous stress on logistic systems. Really, it may not just have the logistical capacity, if you like, to capture the amounts of CO2 we will need to do by 2050. So, if nothing else, I think this concept of climate logistics hopefully should alert business people and also policymakers to the interrelationship, if you like, between and you're trying to achieve one climate objective and another, because some of these objectives, sadly, are in conflict, it seems to me. And somehow we're going to have to resolve them within this general framework of climate logistics.
Oh, there is a lot to think about and a lot to digest in what you've just said. I like that being aware of the silos, that adaptation is key, and maybe that we need to widen the lens a little bit on the way we look at logistics and logistics decarbonization and look at the bigger picture and also look at maybe a longer term picture at the role of logistics. It's not just something, not a problem to be solved, but also something that is going to help solve problems and needs to adapt to the world that we're moving towards. Alan, I'm going to call that a great place to end our first episode. So that would bring us to the end of episode 1 of this 3-part series. In our next episode, we will look at the 5 levers of decarbonization, global progress on these levers, and barriers to higher impact. I'm your host, Andy Golding, joined for this series by Professor Alan McKinnon. Alan, thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Until next time.